There are a lot of vocab words that go along with studying genetics, so I just want to make sure you guys are comfortable and familiar with these. If you don't use them right, you're going to get questions wrong on the exam. So when we talk about different things that we can observe about organisms, there's ways that we can describe them. So with Mendel and his pea plants, they had unique characters, okay? So one character that was being followed was flower color, okay? And then that flower color came in different traits. So there were purple flowers and there were white flowers. And when he set up his crosses, he started with parents that were true breeding. What that meant was if you crossed a purple flower to a purple flower, all of the offspring were purple. If you crossed a white flower to a white flower, all of the offspring were white, okay? But we're going to get into what was actually happening at the genetic level with those true breeding parents, okay? So the parents that were true breeding, okay, were crossed to one another, and then the offspring that were produced were hybrids. They were a mixture of these two true breeding parents, but they only had one phenotype. All of the offspring had the purple characteristic that was present in this parent and not the white one. So what was going on there, okay? We have two different vocab words that you need to know about. There's genotype versus phenotype. The phenotype is what you see. So in the parental generation, this parent has the purple phenotype and this parent has the white phenotype. And in the F1s, all of the offspring have the purple phenotype. So phenotype is a physical characteristic you see. But all of these offspring have the same phenotype as this parent. And what's happening there is what's going on with their genetics. So those true breeding parents had two copies or two alleles that were identical to each other. Okay? So these are the purple parents, and they had two copies of the purple gene. These are the white flowered parents, and they had two copies of the white gene. So in the hybrids, they got one purple copy of the gene from this parent and one white copy of the gene from the other parent, okay? These offspring have two different versions of those genes, but they have the same phenotype as the purple parent, okay? What combination of alleles or what versions of the genes they have are called their genotype, and we have vocab words that describe those genotypes. True breeding parents that had two copies of the same allele are homozygous. And that's true of both the purple parents and the white parents. The offspring that have two different versions of the gene, okay, are called heterozygous. Whether you're homozygous or heterozygous is a description of your genotype. Okay? But what physical traits you have doesn't necessarily go with only a single genotype. These offspring that are heterozygous are also purple. Okay? So they have the purple phenotype, but they have the heterozygous genotype. Their purple flowered parents have the purple phenotype, but they have two copies of the purple allele, okay? So they have a homozygous genotype. But these guys also have a homozygous genotype. They have a white phenotype, but they have two copies of the white allele, so they have a homozygous genotype. Since these guys have the same phenotype as their parents, okay, even though they have this white allele that's hidden, okay, what that tells us is that the purple version of the gene is dominant. What dominant means is if you have two copies of the gene, the dominant allele is the one that contributes to your phenotype. The other allele that's hidden is the recessive allele. So to be more specific, these white parents are homozygous recessive. These purple parents are homozygous dominant. The offspring, their genotype is heterozygous. They're not heterozygous dominant, they're just heterozygous. Their genotype is heterozygous. But their phenotype is they have the dominant phenotype. So, you can be homozygous dominant, like the purple parents. You can be homozygous recessive, like the white parents. But the genotype for the F1s is heterozygous. You can have parents that have the dominant phenotype that are homozygous. You can have offspring that have the dominant phenotype that are heterozygous. Okay? But the only way to have the recessive phenotype is if you're homozygous recessive. Go through the slides that go along with this chapter. All of the definitions are spelled out for you. So a gene is a stretch of DNA that builds a protein that conveys a particular phenotype in the organism. But what phenotype you have depends on what allele or what version of that gene you have. And the locus is the physical location of that gene on the chromosome. So for our example over here, the flower color locus or the P locus has two different alleles. It has two different versions. If we think about the chromosomes, right, you could have the parents that have the dominant allele on their chromosomes. Excuse me, I'm popping beads back. Or they have the recessive allele on each of their chromosomes, right? And then the offspring get one chromosome from this parent and one chromosome from this parent. And so the offspring are heterozygous on those homologous chromosomes. All right, so you should be very comfortable with these vocab words because you need to know them forwards and backwards, inside and out, the difference between heterozygous versus homozygous dominant versus homozygous recessive, and the difference between genotype versus phenotype. So we come to a problem, which is sometimes we see offspring that have a particular phenotype, and we can't tell what genotype it is. Okay. So what phenotype is this flower? Well, it's purple, which is the dominant phenotype. But what genotype is it? It could be heterozygous or it could be homozygous recessive. The way we can figure that out is by doing a test cross. So if we have an individual who has the dominant phenotype, we know one of their alleles for sure. We know that they have at least one dominant copy of the gene. But we don't know what their other allele is. So if we're doing something like flowers, we could cross that dominant phenotype individual, where we don't know their second allele, to a homozygous recessive individual. All of the offspring are going to get a recessive allele from that homozygous recessive parent. At least half of them will get a dominant allele from our dominant phenotype unknown genotype parent. And then by looking at the phenotype of the rest of the offspring that are produced, we can figure out whether this parent is heterozygous or homozygous dominant. If we do this cross and we get any offspring that have the recessive phenotype, what that tells us is that this dominant phenotype parent must be heterozygous, because the only way for the offspring to have two recessive alleles is if they get one from each parent. If we do the cross and all of the offspring have the dominant phenotype, okay, that gives us evidence that this parent up here is likely homozygous dominant. But it depends on how many offspring we produce, right? If we get just one offspring with the dominant phenotype, that's not enough to tell us for sure that this parent is homozygous dominant. If we do 1,000 crosses and get 1,000 offspring and they all have the dominant phenotype, that gives us pretty strong assurance that this parent is homozygous dominant. However, it's just up to chance, right? So you could, just like you could flip a coin and get heads 10 times in a row, you could also flip a coin and get, or effectively flip a coin and get, 10 dominant phenotype offspring, even if this parent here was heterozygous. So we can't always do a test cross, right? It's not ethical to do test cross with humans. We can't say, you have brown eyes. I'm going to breed you to someone with blue eyes to find out if you're heterozygous or homozygous dominant. Instead, what we do is we look at self-selected matings. We look at family trees or pedigrees to determine whether a trait is dominant or whether an individual with a dominant phenotype is heterozygous or homozygous dominant. So when you're looking at these pedigrees, what you should do is look for two individuals that have the same phenotype. So for example, if having a widow's peak was the recessive trait, would it be possible for two parents with a recessive phenotype to have an offspring with the dominant phenotype? It's not possible, right? So what that means is that these parents that have the same phenotype, that have a child that doesn't look like them, must be dominant and must be heterozygous, okay? And the child that doesn't look like them must have the recessive phenotype, getting one recessive allele from each parent. This child over here could be homozygous dominant, getting a big A from this parent and a big A from this parent, or they could be heterozygous if both of these parents are heterozygous. The shading in a pedigree just tells us whether the trait being followed is present or absent, but it doesn't tell us whether the trait is dominant or recessive. So again, look for two parents that have the same phenotype. If white was the dominant characteristic, they could have children that don't look like them. But if white were recessive, there'd be no way for these two parents to have children with a recessive phenotype. So in this pedigree, white is dominant and being shaded in is the recessive characteristic. So these two parents must be heterozygous, and the child that doesn't look like them must be homozygous recessive. You're going to solve similar problems like this in the genetics lab by looking at different pedigrees.